Welcome, everyone. Welcome, one and all, including members of the Rickards family and distinguished guests. At the outset, on behalf of us all, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of this place in which we are joining in person, and the traditional owners throughout Australia of the lands from which Zoom attendees are joining us. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, as well as to their young and their families. Sovereignty was not granted to the invaders, and we thank the traditional custodians for their grace in countenancing this gathering this evening. I'm Susie Dean, and I'm privileged to greet everyone here and on Zoom on behalf of Mental Health for the Young and their families to the 15th Winston S. Rickards Memorial Oration. I'm especially honoured to greet Catherine Liddle, CEO of SNAICC, the Voice for Our Children, who will deliver the oration titled Changing Minds and Changing Attitudes, Reframing Systems to Close the Gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Organised and funded by MIF, the oration is co-sponsored by groups with which Winston Rickards worked closely: the Royal Children's Hospital Mental Health Service, the Mental Health Foundation Australia, the Faculty of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists of the RANZCP, Emerging Minds, and the RCH Centre for Community Child Health. Representatives of these organisations are with us tonight, some in person and some on Zoom. Winston Rickards' interdisciplinary work in child, adolescent and family mental health was groundbreaking nationally and internationally. Among many other initiatives, he was the founding president of MIF. We remain indebted to his vision for the well-being of the young and his determination in the face of stiff odds. More than ever, MIF's role, a sole public advocacy for all children's mental health in Australia is critical in our uncertain times, contributing to rising awareness of mental health in communities around the world. MIF has had a really good working relationship with the Victorian Aboriginal Health Centre, which or service, I should say, which joining with Indigenous colleagues in Canada, New Zealand, and in South America too, resulted in the 2018 International Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Children, Adolescents and Families to Mental Health and Wellbeing. And I'm going to organise that we will later send a copy of the declaration to all present this evening. Now, our oration is about to begin. First, though, those here present, please silence your mobile phone. And for you people on Zoom, I just need to advise you that you can adjust the images that appear on your screen by moving your mouse to the left and to the right. You can enlarge things and decrease them in size. That's up to you. Now, when Catherine concludes after 45 minutes or so, Paul McDonald, our orator from last year, will respond to her presentation, and then we'll welcome general discussion. Closer to 9:30, Our General Secretary, Dr. Alan Maudsley, will say a few words, present a vote of thanks and bring formalities to a close. Our Zoom participants will depart, and as people present move back to the foyer, a photo will be taken with the orator out the front here. You will then have a chance to speak with her and with each other once we're all assembled outside in the lobby. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our orator. Catherine Liddle is an Arrante Lurcha woman from Central Australia and has been SNAICC's Chief Executive Officer since January 2021. She first and foremost describes herself as a storyteller, weaving narratives and cultural perspectives that promote the strengths and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. Catherine joined SNAICC with a strong background in senior management roles with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, government and media. She has experience leading multidisciplinary teams, managing workplace transformations and advocating for policy and system reform. As CEO of SNAICC, she is focusing her leadership on ensuring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's rights are upheld to ensure their safety, development and well-being. Catherine's motivation has always been to drive change that leads to positive outcomes and options for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Catherine is excited to be continuing to build the organisation's strong platform in representing the voice of the next generation, our children. Catherine, please join me at the podium.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I don't think I'll ever get used to listening to your bio, but sometimes it is lovely to sometimes hear how you are perceived by others, because I don't write my own bio. So whoever's written that has done me a great honour. I'd like to start, of course, by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Worimi peoples, members of that incredible Kulin nation. As introduced, I come from a long way away, actually. My country is not as beautiful and green as this one. It is beautiful in another way. I belong to the Central Australian regions. Many of you will know the landmarks that define my country. Some of them sit to the southwest of Alice Springs. One of the big ones, Uluru. I'm sure you're all familiar with Uluru. She's a beautiful icon, and the way we describe it in belonging to my grandmother's country is we belong to the Kunia. And if you've never been to that country, the Kunia is the great snake. And if you're not familiar with the stories of our people, and it is a story that is familiar regardless of what nation you walk to and talk to, they will always talk to the snakes as the bringers of transformation. So in many ways, I wonder if our Kunia set me on the path that I come to you on today. You'd also know the landmarks of Wataka, our national park, our great national park, Kings Canyon as the other name, and of course Alice Springs and Bundaringa being my grandfather's country. Very, very different countries, the ones that I come from. On my nana's country, I'm sure you can see those great icons, but if you belong to that country, believe it or not, that's not what we speak of. We speak of our giant red sandhills and our giant trees, our beautiful desert oaks that sing with the songs of our grandparents. When the wind blows on that particular country, it will lift up the topsoil. So the soil in that country is so perfectly smooth. It lifts and it dances. And again, you see your ancestors dancing, and they bring the stories to life. Beautiful sound, because the great desert oaks, they whisper. On my grandfather's country, very, very different country, Arranta country, and you can hear that in the Arrantas, very different mob. That country, a lot tougher, a lot rougher. And if you walk on that country, you'll hear the difference even in your footprints, because instead of that soft whisper, it's more of a crunch because the gravel is stronger. Fiercely fought for country, this one. If you've ever been to that country, you're greeted by our incredible rangers, beautiful rangers, our dead caterpillars, our dead ancestors, who stand as a warning to anyone of how hard we will fight to keep our families strong and protect our families. That whole landscape tells the story of how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people understand how to keep our children together, and it's interwoven throughout that landscape. So those rangers talk to how fiercely we'll protect it, but the small hills that are dotted around the region talk to the story of women and how women believe in protecting their families and what will happen if you are disconnected from your family. These are the incredible stories that Aboriginal people can see just by landing in that environment. And it is a great gift that when we go to other people's country, we can look for those stories to understand how to work with the ancestors so that we don't make mistakes when we enter other people's countries. And of course, those beautiful welcomes that mob give us to go, it's okay, we know who you are, our ancestors are talking to your ancestors, and you're going to be safe in our country. One of the other things I like to learn about are other people's stories, and it was a wonderful thing to do to get an invitation to speak tonight, because I have never been into a room where I actually haven't learnt something. And the opportunity to come into this room meant that I had the opportunity to take a look at the work of Dr. Rickards, and oh my goodness, what an incredible person, what an incredible human being. And a lot of it resonated because it was what was really evident was the passion and commitment to children. And that lays at the heart of how Aboriginal culture works. We have always understood the grandmother's law, and that is that if every child is loved, if every child is fed, and you treat every child as though they are your own, and most importantly, if they know who to go to when they are sad, if they know who to get a hug from, then every child will be strong. But not only will your children be strong, your communities will be strong. So this resonates, but more importantly, what resonates was that call out to see things through the eyes of a child. What are they looking at? And to listen to their voices. Again, something I spend a lot of time doing is listening to children's voices. And one of the stories I heard very recently came from my own family. Very lucky to have two beautiful grandchildren, and one of them, the 4-year-old, keeps me on my feet all the time, right? He doesn't mind a little tussle. Little Chulama is his name. So Chulama is my grandfather's name, and you'll hear that again. It belonged to a different country. It belongs to the Arundas, Chulama. And my grandfather, just this most incredible man, with the most beautiful dark brown eyes and black hair. His eyelashes so long he'd have to trim them to wear his glasses. Just an incredible man. But my grandson, who bears his name, very, very different. My grandfather wasn't so tall. Chulam's going to be a big boy. And his eyes are the most incredible sky blue, and his eyes, his hair are honey, like a mix between honey and straw blonde. And at 4, he comes up to my waist and he likes to tell me about all the things he's learned. And he's walking past me the other day and he goes, "You don't know what I know." I said, "Oh, yeah. Tell me, what is it that you know?" And he said, "I know I'm a genius." I said to him, "Oh, you're a genius, are you?" He goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Tell me, what does a genius do?" And he says, "Genius stuff." I said, "Well, can you give me an example?" And he said, "Well, I know Nana doesn't really live on an aeroplane." I said, "Okay, this is good. I'm glad we've worked this one out." He said, "I know that I can turn the TV on. That's really good." He said, "I know that you can buy goggles." And that came about because he'd always wanted a pair of goggles and didn't realize you could get them at the shop. And he just happened to drop the fact that he wanted goggles to swim in the bath so he could look for sharks. And he got taken to the shop to buy goggles. Now, that's his environment. And it talks about the things that are important to him, you know, his connection to his Nana, who's always on aeroplanes. The fact that when he comes to Nana's house, it's the highlight of his life, and he loves to swim in the bath. And when Nana's home, it's a big adventure to have a bath. Then I heard another story the same day about a little boy living out in the bush. And this little boy was talking about who his superheroes were. And he said, oh, my superhero is my Jumble. Again, a grandfather. And this Jumble says, he says, well, what is it that you love about your Jumble? And he said, well, he learned me how to hunt kangaroo. And I love that lilt of Aboriginal language. It's a beautiful, it's like a sing-song. It's so beautiful. Not as many words, but just the words that you need. He learned me how to hunt kangaroo. Does he do anything else? Yeah. He teach me how to look for snakes. Again, those things fundamental to the environment that that little boy lives in, because obviously kangaroo, you need to be able to eat in the bush, and hunting snakes, massive. When you grow up out bush, it's one of the first things you're taught is how to look for snakes, because you're not getting to a doctor anytime soon if you've been bitten. And again, there's no lights at night time, so you need to know to look for those things. So I love listening to children. And I love listening to understanding what's important to them. But one of the things that worries me at this point in time is that it feels like something's coming. And I'm pretty certain you in the audience and anyone online feels it. And it makes me think of that other place that my grandson likes to put me, and that's in aeroplanes. And many of you who might spend a little bit too much time in aeroplanes would know you never really know what your flight's going to be like. And one of the most incredible things I saw recently was perfect day. You're looking out the window and you can see nothing but the beautiful landscape of Central Australia. And the pilot's so confident, and he says, not only is this going to be a fast flight, it's going to be faster than normal. We're going to get you to Perth to Alice Springs in less than an hour and a half. And this is awesome. This is awesome news for me, because if you're not familiar with me, I'm a little bit scared of flying. So this is really good news. Anyhow, one of the ways I deal with that is to write stories. And sometimes I'm writing about how the plane might be behaving. Sometimes I'm writing about what I see down on the landscape and how I might frame that into policy. Believe it or not, I use that to talk to you about policy, which will come. And I'm looking out that window and it is beautiful. And then all of a sudden, there was this little cloud, just this one little tiny cloud. So I wrote it down. I see a cloud. And then there's another cloud. Still nothing to worry about, but just a pop, right? Just a pop. That's a bit interesting. Then there's a few more little clouds, and I'm like, oh, okay. What are these clouds? They're not quite turbulence, but they're making the plane rock. And then the most incredible thing happened. Everything went silent. And I don't know if you've ever been on a plane when everything goes silent and everything goes still, but every fiber in your being tells you something's about to hit. And down came the supercell. Out of nowhere, we were not expecting this supercell, and it made that plane rock, and it made that plane bounce, and strange things happened, like people felt the need to get out of their seats and fall over. And again, I know that that's a trauma response. People are terrified, but this plane is rocking, absolutely rocking. And the trolley's not quite locked up, so it's banging, and the pilot comes on. He says, look, we don't know where this has come from, but it's going to take us a while to get out of this one. And it's that moment in time where you have to lean in and tell yourself the narrative that says, whoever built this plane did a really good job. There's some incredible engineering here. Whoever's flying that plane really knows what they're doing, because we're going to get hit and we don't know how long we're going to get hit for. So eventually we get down about 3 hours later. So much for an hour and a half flight. And we land on the ground, and you know what? It's not clear yet, because the supercell that we just escaped hit us again. So we spent another 45 minutes on the plane because you can't get off a plane when there's lightning. And I love that story. And I love that story because it helps me talk to people about some of the things that are happening with children right now. And one of those is there's lots of little pockets of noise that are bouncing around the children. And imagine it's children in that plane. And there's pilots at the front, and maybe they're the parents, but they're a little bit away from the children. And they might know how to raise those children, and they might love those children to pieces, but geez, that plane is getting bounced. And storms are a funny thing. There's an incredible beauty in them, and there's something Aboriginal people have understood for a long time. They've understood how to sing them. And it feels like we're in the middle of not necessarily a supercell, but maybe a perfect storm, because the winds are coming from so many directions. And many of them are rooted in that ugly thing called racism. And when we think about the organisation I worked for, SNAICC, it was stood up largely rooted on the impact of racism. And it's an ugly word and it makes people uncomfortable. Certainly makes the people who experience it really, really uncomfortable. But it was acknowledgement from Aboriginal people right across the country that the worst policies in Australia, the most horrific policies in Australia, almost without fail, are written to impact unfairly on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And it's easy to say maybe 200 years ago or maybe 50 years ago with the stolen generation, but let's be honest, some of the most horrific policies that we see right now are targeted at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And those policies are written because they make people angry, and up goes your turbulence, one little cloud, here's your next little cloud. All of a sudden, you've got a supercell that's going to rock a plane, and supercells are incredibly powerful. So SNAICC was stood up to help ride out that plane, to help reinforce the plane, to help families and children get through a really rocky ride. One of the ways we do it is to advocate to government about what we know will keep that plane flying, what we know keeps children in those seats feeling safe, and that is their families. What we know keeps them strong, and what we know keeps them connected to those stories like the ones I'm sharing with you that say, you are remarkable. Our understanding of how to read landscapes is unparalleled. You belong to the oldest living culture in the world. My goodness, what an incredible legacy to stand on. This is nothing to be ashamed of. This is something to be incredibly, fiercely proud of. And the authority that those voices gave us to stand this peak up, keep us strong today. Because let's be honest, anyone who works in this field takes a few of those storms themselves. What gets us through again is those voices. Every room that we go into, the incredible hopes and aspirations that people in those rooms talk about, the incredible solutions that they bring to the table, always a solution. And at the heart of it, children. I don't know how many of you have been in rooms with a lot of Aboriginal people, but you'll probably find any room you walk into, maybe the first thing they say is our children. Every speech I've ever every speech I've heard delivered by an Aboriginal person will mention children within maybe the first 5 minutes, because it is rooted in who we are. Grandmother's law, one whole side of our law system. This is way before the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. One whole half of our law system dedicated to the protection and the nurturing of our children. An incredible legacy for our children to stand on. So our job is about reinforcing that story and saying, well, if you worked with us, we might get some different results, because the results right now don't look really flash. We know that before colonisation, there was no such thing as a child removal because we had families. Our children don't belong to parents. They belong to their families. They belong to their communities. Many mums, many dads, many cousins, many brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles, all of them your family. But today it's not a story that we see a lot. Now, what we see is when a family might be in strife, rather than their families being able to wrap around them and keep them strong, systems have been developed to remove them. Systems that are creating an incredible chasm in the number of our children entering out of home systems. And many of you will know what the horrific impact of child removals are and what the intersection between really tough tertiary systems are once we remove a child. We know that those things are often referred to as a gap, and I'm sure you've all heard this. Closing the gap, it's something that we work on. And again, it's a funny thing to talk about because on my country, again, many of our mob, they're not familiar with rooms like this one. They're not familiar with words like policy. They read policy in the environment. And when you talk to people about closing the gap, it's almost like not only the chasm that's happening with the impacts of systems and policies on our children, it's a chasm in understanding how those policies were rooted in that really ugly word racism and how that impacts on you on the ground. So how are we where we are right now? I think what's really surprising about it is even people that say ugly things, if you were to ask them, should we have good outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children? I reckon they'd say yes. I think that's pretty fundamental. Most people are going to say yes, regardless of how they might be framing at any point in time. They're going to say, actually, all children do deserve to live with their families, and all children should be able to enter any premises and feel safe. And children are valued and loved. So something else is going wrong in the environment in that supercell. We know that there's a different way to tell this story. It's about how we master that and how we make that story connect with other people to really move away from the language of closing the gap and really lean into what it takes. And if I give you the imagery of my country, where we've got those incredible ranges and the gap in the middle, that's landscape. It took thousands of years to build that landscape. So the forces we're going to need in order to close that gap are going to be as powerful as that. Now, we don't want to take thousands and thousands and millions of years to be able to do that, but the forces we need to fill that gap are going to be massive, and they're going to need to come from multiple directions. So it means a willingness to have some really tough conversations about how that gap happened in the first place. The policy itself has been around for about 20 years. And it was a response to incredible equity in health and life expectancy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Children actually weren't necessarily a priority as we understand it in the national agreement today. But it was, it was the first time people from across the country, governments from across the country had said, maybe we played a role in this and maybe we need to come together to help solve it. But we know that despite everyone coming together and saying we've got to do something different, progress was really slow. And if you talk to anyone who works under the agreement today, you'll say, well, part of that problem was Aboriginal people weren't actually at the table talking about what was important at that time. So a number of the targets were the ones we weren't particularly interested in, or were a little bit off track. And again, those of you who work in child development will know it's one thing to say, let's get children into preschool, because the evidence is really clear. If children get into preschool, chances are they're going to get into high school. Chances are they're going to finish high school, going to get a job. This makes perfect sense until you drill the data. And when you drill the data, you realize actually no point in going to preschool if we haven't got your first 3 to 5 years right, if we haven't got you on track developmentally. So one of the things we worked on was making sure we were actually responding to where the need was and putting the emphasis of closing the gap on children. And one of the stories we will tell is that if you want to close the gap, you've got to start with the children. If you get those characteristics right, everything gets better. So we came together with a lot of other peaks to be able to bring forward new targets and to be able to work on what is genuinely systems reform. That was 4 priority reforms identified by every single consultation around the country, different nations, different parts of the country, different concerns, but every single one of those rooms identified the 4 characteristics of system reform. No one was taught system reform, they just understood it, and it had to start with being at the table and being able to have a conversation. So we've had some incredible wins under closing the gap, but we're not moving fast enough, and our progress remains mixed, sometimes stalled, and when we look at the targets for children, still going backwards. So it's more comprehensive than it's ever been. It's more collaborative than it's ever been. But the forces still aren't strong enough. We might be committed to formal partnerships with our government partners and shared decision making with our formal partners, and that's all layers of government. But progress on even understanding what a partnership is really tough. Building the Aboriginal community controlled sector, really tough, even though it's nonsensical, because when you look at the closing the gap targets, the majority of services that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people access across the country are not delivered by Aboriginal organisations. That gap is not ours. When you drill the data and the data is limited, what you see very quickly is the outcomes that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations get are generally significantly better. And Victoria, this country that I'm standing on right now, has some of the most incredible data to reflect what happens when Aboriginal communities are genuinely at the table, are genuinely able to design their programs, and genuinely able to invest in supporting their families first. Now, don't get me wrong, there's massive gaps even in the data in an incredible progressive state like Victoria, because we're talking about a system, and what we haven't been able to do is stop the system drivers. We don't have control of the system drivers. So 6 years into the 11-year-long Closing the Gap National Agreement, only 4 of the 18 targets are on track to be met by 2031. Most of them, at the time we signed that agreement, were actually achievable, including the targets that relate to early education and care and out-of-home removals. We only needed to shift the dial by 0.2% to be able to have closed that target, and we are wildly off track. The Productivity Commission review in 2024 found that governments and bureaucracies were largely not abiding by this incredible agreement because there are no consequences to not abiding by it. What we found was not surprised that Aboriginal communities were coming to the table. They were showing up, that our organisations were lifting and running at the speed of lightning, but the policies were not keeping pace, and the change required within our government systems was stalling. So we know that governments want to close that gap. We know that. But we also know that they're not really good at coming forward and confronting what caused the gap in the first place, what is causing the system not to move. We know that the gap is not accidental. And this is the horrific part about confronting systems. The gap was not accidental. The gap was a product of system design. As you'd all know, removing children from Aboriginal families has been part of Australia's culture for a very long time. It was done by design. Those systems are shaped by things like colonisation, and I really dislike losing that word. I really do, because I know that when people hear it, they sort of go like this. I get that, because when you're an Aboriginal person, you actually do that as well, because it's an ugly, confronting word when you think about what it means. You turn up on someone else's country and you effectively eradicate them. What does that mean? Because that's a really tough word. Well, what does that mean when we're sitting in a room like this one? It means that in Australia, every law, every policy, every building, every road, the banks, the schools, they were all introduced to go over the top of ours. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in Australia are the only children in this country to experience that, where everything that we interact with was designed to go over the top of our ways of understanding the world, our ways of reading policy, our ways of raising children. It's an uncomfortable truth that we not only need to deal with system reform, we really need to confront that really ugly word racism and what racism looks like in our systems. Again, it's not saying everybody is racist. It's saying the systems themselves are racist. And again, that's a really challenging one because you hear that word and you go, well, I'm not. I'm not the beneficiary of a racist system. I'm not a racist person. Again, that's not what we're saying. The systems are designed to target and treat Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children differently. It's embedded, and the outcome of that is seen in child protection, it's seen in education, it's seen in health, and it's seen in youth justice. One of the stories we've heard recently, in one of the conversations we had, was about a little one from Alice Springs, and she's big now, but she was talking to us about when she started primary school, and she couldn't wait. What 5-year-old can't wait to start primary school? You got your school uniform, you got your lunchbox, you get your teacher, you're going to have friends. It's going to be awesome. So she starts and she loves drawing, and that's what she wants to do on her first day of school. She is loved. She is secure. She's got this giant family that just thinks she's awesome, and everyone's taken photos, and off she goes to school. But the classroom wasn't secure, not for this little one. Because the first thing that happens is someone asks her if her dad's in jail. And they asked her if her dad was in jail because they'd heard her parents saying, I think her dad's been locked up. Does anyone even seen her dad? She said to us that her teacher heard that conversation and all of a sudden started treating her differently, not to make her more secure, but to say, do you need, maybe you need a little bit of help over here, and not help like, let's see who we can talk to about how we improve your drawings. Let's see who we can bring in to talk to you differently. Again, looks like support, but isn't quite support. What it actually did was lower the bar on expectations for this baby girl. At home, she goes home and she's a bit stressed now. She's really upset because what should have been the most exciting day of her school journey is one she's going to remember for the rest of her life because of how it made her feel. So she goes home, and like many of our families, they're living in out of overcrowded homes. And again, that's not the fault of the family. There's not enough homes to go around. So she's overcrowded, it's noisy, she's stressed, her family's stressed. Not surprisingly, she, as she goes on this journey, starts to withdraw. By 10, the story being told about her in the school is that she's disruptive. So again, we've got to move her. We've got to treat her differently. By 12, completely disengaged. She couldn't care less. This little girl who couldn't wait to start school. By 14, she's in the justice system. And somewhere along the way, people, instead of saying, how do we support this child, said, what's wrong with her? And that's another story, the difference between mandatory notifications and mandatory support. We often hear about these stories, and we often hear what happens when the system now kicks in. And many of you will know what the impact of that is and what the elements of those are. And we hear child protection services right across the country stand up, and ministers right across the country stand up and say, our systems are broken. It makes you want to bang your head against a wall because the system is not broken, it is designed. It is working so effectively that children across the country are removed at a rate that it should be seen as a national disgrace. The numbers are horrific. Some of the data we were looking at the last quarter of last year indicated that we're probably seeing 2,000 children removed from their homes, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in a quarter. These numbers are horrific. Currently today, my home, Alice Springs, about 22,000. That's about the same number of children, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, that sit in out of home care. When you drill those systems, some of the studies, and this one's a New South Wales study, will show that many of those children, most of those children should never have been removed in the first place. So you drill the data again, and what you see is the system gets worse the deeper you get into the system, and the impacts for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children get worse. And I'm talking, when I say none of that, so most of those children should not have been removed, I'm talking about notifications that were not substantiated, sometimes just one or two. And it's enough to get a child removed because of how the system and the lens looks at this particular child. So racism can look different depending on who's looking at it and who's telling the story. Again, for this room, I know you're all experts in this. Racism causes psychological dysregulation. It impacts on children's immune systems. There are psychological responses. There are changes in health behaviour. There are sleep patterns, and we all know the impact of that. And then there's things, those really ugly things like substance abuse. We know that there's a growing body of research that's found our children are not oblivious, nor are they safe from interpersonal and systemic racism. They see it and they feel it and they understand it. The evidence is now starting to suggest that children may in fact experience worse adverse effects than adults. Exposure to racism as early as the ages of 4 to 5, we know increase the risk of poor mental health outcomes. We know that the exposure to structural inequality begins early. As an example of this, the Closing the Gap data shows that only 34% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are developmentally on track. Poor outcomes are not demonstrators of deficits in children. They are early indicators of system bias and exclusion. Lack of access to culturally safe services, experiences in racism in early education, and social determinants like housing and poverty are key elements of this exclusion and this bias. The systemic bias is most blatantly evident, of course, in the child protection systems and the youth justice systems that we've talked about. They're not only overrepresenting our children, what they're indicating is our children are overly surveilled. You've all heard their calls for inquiries, and yet what the data actually shows is something very, very different. Anyone who's looked at the Australian maltreatment study would know that Australia does need to have a really good look at how it treats children right across the board, regardless of what suburb or country you live in. Our families are policed, not supported, and our children are removed because of poverty, which is largely called neglect. They're taken from their families. Very few are reunited with those families. When that happens, their culture is erased, that ability to stand up here and talk to you about the way we see the world, that ability to say, I belong to my nation, I know my words, even where those words are being reawoken. I can tell you who my family is. I can tell you I belong to the kunia, and I can tell you the role she played. So racism is not just prejudice, it's built into policy funding and decision making. And I know that some of that's really grim, and I apologise for taking you on that dark journey. But we do know that there's a lot of calls at this moment in time to tell truth telling. And again, that confronts people. And it's an extraordinary thing because it's not saying we want to make you uncomfortable. It's the opportunity for people to tell you what happened to them so that you get a different lens, so that we can tell the story a different way. What I see, though, while I've taken you down some of the really ugly paths, what I see from Mob every day, though, is really hopeful. We always look for blue sky. We always look for the stories that inspire us. We always look for the solutions. And fundamentally, we know that with enough power, we can transform those systems. We can close that gap. But we know we need your help in this because we've got to shift perspectives in thinking from seeing vulnerabilities and that ugly story to the incredible hope and the incredible inspiration that our families and our services and our communities bring. We need to work past our feelings of failure and feeling personally responsible about it, and going, well, how do we personally push in on systems design so that we don't have a story that talks about Aboriginal families neglecting their children, but rather how incredible our families are at protecting our children at investing in our children. We need to talk about what we need to do to change systems that embed deficit narratives, because even the closing the gap, it's a gap. It's a gap. There's another way to tell this story, and we need to see it not as an isolated failure, but as a systemic pattern. And we need to look at how our children moves through that system. I really dislike that word system, but it's true. A system is built to move a child through it. So a child is not in isolation in one department, one arm over there, one leg over there. A child is a child. What happens if we change the system? Well, we already know what works. This is one of the aggravating tension points in this. We already know what works. We know that systems can change, and we know that outcomes can change. We know that there's a wealth of evidence in policy and practice that demonstrates the incredible impact of Aboriginal-led and Aboriginal-informed decision-making and reform. Many of you would have seen our Family Matters report. Again, when we talk about child protection, no one was looking at these numbers until our families said, find a way to hold governments to account. No one was actually paying attention to not only how many children were being removed, but where they were being placed, how they were being placed, what the impact was on them, how many would enter justice systems as a result of that intersection, how many of them might self-harm. And again, this room, I'm sure, is very familiar with that. It's horrific. Children who haven't had access to early education and care more likely to come into contact with child protection systems. Children in child protection systems more likely to come into contact with other tertiary systems, more likely to self-harm, less likely to have jobs. It's a horrific story. It's a horrific story, and it can't be looked at in isolation. But the data, while it is grim, has sparks of hope. And again, the Family Matters report tells you what works. It drills into those incredible stories. And I'm going to give you the opportunity to have a listen to one right now, because I've been talking for a long time. So if we could play our first video, please.
Boinga, Manila, brr, brr, boinga, Manila, brrka, Manila, boinga, Manila, brr, brr, boinga, Manila, brrka, Manila, wah, 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 hee, boinga, Manila, brr, brr, boinga, Manila, brrka, Manila, boinga, Manila, brr, brr, boinga, Manila, brrka, Manila, wah, 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 hee.
My name's Clark Webb. I'm the CEO of Bulletin Young Aboriginal Corporation. I'm a Goombenga man. I'm also Manjalang. And basically, established our corporation, Bemenak, in 2010. And it was a series of after-school learning centres that we started running with our children, which then led into cultural camps and that type of thing. And in 2015, we invited a man to come to Goombenga country from America. His name is Dr. SNAICC Grey Morning, and he's developed this method of teaching language called Accelerated Second Language Acquisition. From there, we got this inspiration to create our own spaces for the teaching of our language. So not long after, we started teaching here at Coolai, and then we decided that our children need primary schooling as well in Goombenga.
It came from community and from our elders, and from the need for a space where children can carry their language forever. And if we were to truly create speakers again of Goombenga, we had to start from our children, and we had to give them that space. We opened in 2021, and we've grown from 14 students to 85 students, and from K-2 to right up to Year 8 now. And so it's been incredible, and it's come from the vision from community and what community has asked for, really, a space for our children to speak their language and know their culture and learn through their culture and their language and community.
Growing up in an Aboriginal community, there was a lot of, we were very, Mum was afraid, I suppose, of speaking her language, because we weren't taught that when we were kids, how to be culturally confident.
Whether or not these children realise how incredible and what they're doing for the history and for the future of Gumbenga language. I'm not sure yet, but we can certainly see it. And to have elders in the crowd like Uncle Gary Williams, and to have Brother Steve here to witness those children speaking in a language where they may not have thought children would be speaking again is incredible. And so we've got children up here telling full stories and reading children's books and singing and dancing proud in their language and culture again. And it's amazing for our children, but it must be so amazing for our community to see that coming back again. So I'm forever grateful, and you would have seen me with a huge smile on my face all day today because I'm endlessly proud.
What we want is for them to be better speakers than us. So we want them to finish school and then come back as teachers and early childhood educators and language teachers, as Auntie Julie said today, and then the generation they teach will become stronger again. Culture's the core. Culture's the core for everything, for our children. Everything, you know, social skills, listening skills, confidence, learning in any area, it all starts with culture.
The Gambanya Ginya Freedom School was a dream by that local community. Just you saw Clark speaking there right at the end. He just had a dream, and he said, I can stand this school up, and I can stand it up by myself. And he had no funding, he just did it. And he has changed the life outcomes for so many children. They speak all day in language on that country, on that school. And one of the most wonderful stories I've heard from that school was when a little one knew that he was in trouble because the teacher spoke to him in English. So he knew he was in big trouble. But it's a remarkable example of what Aboriginal people can do, and the understanding of how being able to revive our languages and talk to you and work with you the way we would have in our old days really strengthen those children. But one of the things even schools like that struggle with is when they're talking about racism, you can't measure it. It's almost impossible to measure. And I know across the country right now, we're seeing a move to look at it because more and more people are starting to experience it in the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been experiencing it for a very, very long time. And we need to find a way to look at this complex problem differently, because I think a lot of the time people don't even realize they're seeing it or experiencing it themselves. So what does that look like? It means redesigning it. It means thinking about things like how we, and this is an interesting one, how do we transfer power? How do we make sure that people have the ability to talk about self-determination in decision-making in a way that isn't confronting, but rather shows you what happens when you look at the Freedom School. They just had an idea. Not far from there is another early learning service, early childhood service, one of the best ones we've got in the country. And we've got some remarkable services designed by our mob. And it was designed because in that particular community, and it's not so long ago, and let's call that community Tamworth, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were not allowed to access early education and care, and that's not very long ago. And they had to build something themselves, and they started underneath a tree. Today we call that place Birrelly, one of the most incredible examples of Aboriginal systems design and early education in the country. But it started under a tree because our children were impacted by a policy that was designed that said you cannot enter the mainstream schooling service. That's not that long ago. So we need to transfer power in decision-making and self-determination and understand what it means and not be confronted and scared by that. We need to redesign decision-making by understanding what culturally informed risk assessments look like and reducing bias in reporting and decision-making, those things that are apparent in child protection data in particular. We need to fund prevention, not punishment. You'd all know this. Child protection, a great example. The vast majority of the dollars that are supposed to be about keeping children strong and safe are actually invested into removing children In Australia, only 16% of the dollars that are called child protection actually go into looking after children before they hit out of home care systems. It's a massive, massive gap. We also need to look at how we grow more organisations like our Freedom School. We need to also track and hold governments accountable for this overrepresentation and the decision-making bias and the funding inequities. That's a really hard thing to do and something we can't do alone. We know that if we want change, everyone has to believe that that change is possible. We know that everybody has to invest in what it might take for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children to be able to stand up here and tell their stories, talk in language if they want to, design their own schools, design their own systems. We know that one of the biggest challenges we have is neutrality, because neutral systems result in unequal societies. They produce unequal outcomes. We know that if you're a decision maker, you've got a little bit more power than us. So if you happen to be listening in and you are able to make decisions, now's the time to start shifting gears to understand that gap will not change unless we have incredible environmental power and pushes. And we know that we have to start thinking about what a school would look like, as an example, if we designed it ourselves, because we cannot close the gap with the systems that created it and continue to perpetuate it. And we need to put anti-racism at that lens. We need to understand what it looks like, as uncomfortable as it is. We need to be proud of our cultures, proud of them, not as a curiosity, which sometimes happens even when people don't mean it, but genuinely proud of this incredible history that we want to share with you all, that Australia was built on, that is inherent in how this country developed in the way we understand it today. We need to ensure that what we know keeps our children safe and strong is embedded into everything. And it is known that culture keeps children strong. It's just articulating what that might mean, believe it or not, becomes really, really difficult. So one of the things that we tried earlier this year came about when there was a lot of noise about welcome to countries. And the truth of it is our nations in Australia are incredibly diverse. We all do these things very differently, but the vast majority of them nations will have some form of welcome to country for the reasons I talked to you about when we first came into the room. We need to understand what the laws are because they're going to be different no matter where you go. We need to understand how to read those stories so that we are safe, and we need to feel secure and welcomed when we come into those environments. So we went, you know what, we could engage with some of the narrative that was a bit ugly, or we could tell a story a different way. So before I close up, I'm going to start with a welcome from children. If we could play the second video, please.
Aboriginal culture, it's like the oldest living culture that's still going on.
Yama, Nindo, Ebenaya, Gimilori, Gimbangi, Bunjalang, Naya.
Yama Yamande, Gumray, Walay Barganiani, Winningalawa, Yalambu, Mari, Marmala, Ngalay Darwin. This means hello and good morning. We are here in Gamilaroi country and we pay respects to the elders who have cared and still care for this land.
When we're teaching children about acknowledgement of country, we really do take the time to explain to them what it is and what it's about. I think just last week we were revisiting with storytelling and stuff about, that our culture and our language was not available to us when we were younger, So bring it into children's awareness and into their everyday learning is something that's really important for their future cultural and educational growth.
We do an acknowledgement to country out of respect for the newcomers to our land that may be from a different part of Australia.
Up sky, down, we're on the yarrow ground.
You can hear it in their voices, how proud they are. It helps kids feel connected to our Father Sky, our Mother Earth, and just makes me feel proud, like helping them strong future leaders.
feedback that we get from parents when it comes to acknowledgement of country and culture is proud. Like, they're proud. You know, it warms their heart to know that their children are so immersed in culture, and that you should be proud and you should be strong in culture.
Something I think about with my ancestors is making them proud and just following in their footsteps and knowing that they'd be wanting me to do this and it's all for them. And everybody deserves this land. That's why it's their home and really their planet.
My ancestors, they have been on this land for longer than me, and they have learned more language and passed it down, and I'm going to do the same with the next generations.
So it's a welcome to finish us off, and the voice of children to finish us off. They are children, and voices like those are the reasons that we stand up to systems. When they're uncomfortable, we call out things like racism, even though it feels ugly on your tongue. We know that we can confront racism. We know that we can change systems. We know that if we change systems, we can change futures. We know that there's a storm coming. And the question I'd like to pose to all of you is it going to be a supercell that hits us? Or are we going to bring in a perfect storm? And you're brave enough to dance in the rain with us? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Now, I know people are eager to ask questions and respond to the voice of our children. That was wonderful to see, to see all of those young people having their say. But first, I'd like to invite Paul McDonald, last year's esteemed orator, to respond to Catherine's excellent oration. Would you like to take a seat for a moment there, Catherine, and be more comfortable? Paul, as many of you will know, is CEO of Anglicare Victoria, the state's larger provider of foster care, family welfare and youth support services. Previously, he served as Deputy Secretary of the Children, Youth and Family Division of the Department of Human Services of Victoria, overseeing child protection, youth justice and family and domestic violence programs. He's chaired several nationally significant committees, including one on petrol sniffing, and is the former chair of the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. As founding chair, Paul led the Home Stretch campaign, nationally extending the out-of-home care from 18 to 21 years. And we heard about this from him last year, in fact, for which in 2020 he won the National Pro Bono Influence Award. In 2017, Paul received the prestigious Robin Clark Leadership Award, Victoria's most celebrated Child Protection Award, recognising a leader inspiring strides towards better outcomes for the young and their families across Australia, including for First Nations communities. Further, Paul is a patron of the National Youth Workers Association. Paul, would you like to come up and speak, please?
Thanks. As Catherine alluded to, those sort of bios are a little bit excruciating by others. So anyway, good on you for getting through it on the other side. I could have edited it by about 75%. But hello, everyone, and thank you. And thank you for this honour. And firstly, I want to acknowledge the land we stand on, Wurundjeri land, pay my respects to elders both past, present, merging any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the room or on the screen here today, tonight. Also, I want to pay my respects to Catherine Liddle. And I also want to acknowledge the particularly difficult period that has been felt for many First Nation communities and the wider Australian community, but in the main First Nation communities over the last few months here in this country, particularly surrounding the tragic death of baby Kumarjaya and the tragic events on the banks of the Murrumbidgee River recently with mother and her babies. A very difficult time for First Nation communities right around the country. I want to acknowledge that. And I wish to note Kathleen Liddle's contribution in these times, through her writings and comments to the nation on these tragic confronting events. And we hold them in the back of our minds as we listen to Catherine's oration today. Now, as is my custom when I'm talking publicly, I also add a further acknowledgement. I add an acknowledgement to any care leaver listening or in the room today or on screen, attending tonight, and acknowledge the person you are and you have become despite being raised in under state care arrangements. Respect to you also. Now, when I was originally approached to do the response to this year's oration, so last year you do the oration and then Susie tells me, oh, by the way, Paul, you have to do the response to the next year's oration. So nonchalantly, me, pretty casual I am at most things in life, said, yeah, sure, no problem. Just let me know who you're going to get and, I'll pull something together. However, my casual laissez-faire response quickly turned into high anxiety when Susie told me that the deliverer of the following year's oration was none other than Catherine Liddle. I will confess to the audience that I did follow up on this anxiety and sent the organisers an email. And I said, firstly, please check out with Catherine her okay on the appropriateness of someone who's non-Aboriginal, who's white, who's male, who's arguably late middle-aged, who's head of a mainstream faith-based charitable children, youth and family organisation, providing a response to such an individual as Catherine Liddle. However, Susie said Catherine was all good, and I thank Catherine for her reassuring comments that she's okay about me giving this important response. But to begin, I want to say it's been a privilege to provide this response. I've always carried with high regard Catherine Liddle. Whilst we have worked and operated the same field, we have not crossed paths that often. Though I have witnessed from afar Catherine's advocacy and contribution to and for her people, which has not only influenced policy, it has shifted the conversation as she has done again tonight. In my mind, she's always impressed, as again tonight we've witnessed, and her presence and perspectives on the nation's most important matter, that is, our First Nation peoples and the understanding, their experience and the relationship between First Peoples and the rest of the country. She's not only a significant influence in policy and programs, she's a change agent and sits, in my view, and will sit in time to come as one of the great Indigenous voices, along with Pat Turner, Pat O'Shane, Megan Davis and the like. So, in making my comments in this, I also want to say the great success of Homestretch. I also thank Catherine Liddle's outlook, which has influenced my actions in pulling off extended care in every state and territory in this country by 3 further years to 21, and I thank her for that. As well as starting my comments, my first official job as a youth worker went way back in 1979, was the first youth worker for Katherine Town Council in Northern Territory, a town split by colour. It was the only town in Australia at the time that had a Right for Whites march down the main street and experiencing weekly fractious relations both in the local press and out in the street. In Kirby's Cowboys Bar, I was often confronted by the local the local town folk, challenging my work as a youth worker with Aboriginal young people. And since I've always resolved, since that first job, to play my part wherever I am for First Nations communities and people. And the homestretch story that I told last year was in part motivated by over 35% of young people exiting in Australia as Aboriginal and experiencing nothing less than appalling outcomes. In an interview late last year in the widely read national magazine, The Mandarin, Catherine Liddle described that First Nations children are not being failed once, but have been failed twice. The fact that 45% of all kids placed in out-of-home care are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. The fact that Aboriginal children or Torres Strait Islander children are 10 times more likely to be placed in out-of-home care than any other Australian child. And, as Catherine has reminded us, many of these removals were largely, and still are largely, preventable, as she cites in a speech. Child protection, knock on the door. They don't ask, how can I help? They ask the mother, what did you do? And so there sees the start and the step of removal of these children from their mothers and fathers. And then Catherine points out they failed again, with more than a third of First Nations children left such out-of-home care, leaving out-of-home care in what was described in reports as other circumstances. Basically, I'll decode that to homelessness or youth detention. Yet, as Catherine quotes these stats, she reminds us that no other culture can attest to the fact that Aboriginal people have been successfully raising children for over 60,000 years. Catherine's speech asks us to confront some uncomfortable realities, as she pointed out in her speech, from the appalling statistics inflicted on Aboriginal children and families as a result of systems that are ignorant of culture and abusive in treatment, that take a deficit outlook to our First Peoples. The uncomfortable truth that the outcomes outlined in Closing the Gap are in fact not closing at all, because the current system designed by government to respond to these gaps are the very systems that created these gaps in the first place. And despite all of the above, Catherine reminds us, and despite signed agreements by all governments, governments are not abiding by these agreements and moreover are refusing to do so. And in that fact, there are no consequences for governments who fall short of the Closing the Gap targets, when governments are often giving consequences to all sorts of providers in children, youth and family for failing on their own performance. How did we get here? Catherine poses an answer. She leads us to the central and most uncomfortable truth of all of this, and that is that racism in Australia is systemic, structural and embedded across the institutions. It is the shaper of interventions. It is the determinant of outcomes. As the late, great actor, orator and all-time legend, Uncle Jack Charles said in one of his last interviews, Australia is uniquely racist. Catherine takes us through a compelling narrative of this unique racism that Uncle Jack Charles describes. Infiltrated and infected institutions, decision-making, narratives that are negative and poor execution. This is not just the soft bigotry of low expectations that George Bush once described disadvantaged communities and the tasks at hand by government in the United States. This is racism unmasked, unbridled, and ever present. However, she saves us as an audience somewhat from our despair by shining light in this darkness and takes us to a roadmap for governments around the country on how we can embark on a transformation to change the last 200 years of system abuse towards Aboriginal Australians. She cites 5 planks fused in evidence, all with proven outcomes, to take First People to their self-determined future. Bold but proven. or party, bold but proven. And she argues that the only strategy is this self-determination where communities are empowered to determine their own futures and culture and cultural identity is fundamental and valued. It is a call to government to invest in this approach while at the same time get out of the bloody way. And these 5 planks are roadmaps for any and every Australian government. Now, in Victoria, we've seen the types of shine lights of hope and transformative change in the state by the state legislating transferring the powers of the Secretary, the powers of the state to ACOs in relation to caring for children with the powers of child protection. And it should be a surprise to none of us, as Catherine's indicated, that we're now seeing through the ACOs that are involved, VACA, BADAC and others, Rumbalara, is now seeing more children reside with their parents, more reunifications back to parents, and more children enjoying culturally shaped and fused responses to family welfare concern, such as big auntie thinking. Culture is the fundamental to that. And Catherine talks of the gap and closing the gap. So in closing, I'd like to add one further change to this transformation journey that we have to take on as a country and that we must confront as a country. And it is not only that our governments are failing Aboriginal people, but our federation is also. Unlike the countries of United Kingdom, New Zealand, a range of European countries, countries in Asia, and for different reasons, the United States, the policy and program dialogue on child welfare, youth justice is where they are managed by one government. The policy on child welfare and youth justice here in Australia, such responsibilities are managed by 8 different state and territory governments. Last year, when I spoke, I described bringing one universal extended care reform for care leavers in Australia. However, I had to convince not one, but 8 different governments of 8 different political persuasions, of 8 different fickle bureaucracies, through the case that kicking a child out of care at 17 was system abuse and to extend that care to 21. And whilst we did make that successful in all 8 governments, what it points out is this is too hard a road to row to bring the transformational change that Catherine calls upon and we need. And may I say, when it comes to the 9th government of Australia, or the first government of Australia, the federal government, too long the feds have remained in this country aloof, disinterested, and assertively rejecting the types of data coming out of home care and youth justice across the country. So I would argue a new architecture is required if we're to take on Catherine Liddle's national transformation vision. A new approach, a reimagined federation, not for everything, not for most things, but for this thing that allows that vision so that we can thrive on the types of things that we know and Catherine has pointed out would work. And the ability to override the individualised, corrosive state and territory government policies in each state that is only winding the clock back. Adult time for violent crime in Victoria. The Northern Territory's cavalier deconstruction of child protection against Aboriginal children that was announced only several months ago. The fact that Queensland has 2,500 children in group or residential care, 500% above a Victorian population in out-of-home care, despite only 1/3 of the population being in Queensland. These types of powers must be overridden in a view of taking and bringing Aboriginal children and families through to the vision that Catherine argues. And in my mind, that cannot come soon enough. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. He's brought out many of the important points that you raised. Please come this way, Catherine. Cecilia is going to sit at the table there, and she is going to control our Zoom, which I think is here. Is that right? Just unplug it.
Oh, is that it? You're ringing it? Oh no.
Okay. It's okay. We're just getting our Q&A mechanism set up here for our Zoom colleagues. Peggy will look after these two. Will help you. Ariella, could you do this for this side of the room, please? Thank you. And I'll just remind people on Zoom that you can alter the display on your screen by using your mouse left and right. That's the way to do it. Well, we're now open for comments, open for questions. I guess as chair, I'd like to, and as a Victorian, I'd like to ask a first question, to ask Catherine what her views are on how the treaty that was recently reached between First Nations in this state and the state government might assist us all in helping to close the gap.
Oh, look, I think there isn't an Aboriginal group in the country that isn't looking at Victoria going, wow, what an incredible environment to be in, the very first ones to come up with the treaty, and really looking at what that system's design is. And effectively they've matched the government, which means that all decisions have to be vetted by the Koori's, as I understand it. And that's incredible. It means that they're going to be able to hold that system to account in a way that we have never, ever been able to hold it to account before. But ideally, we don't want to be holding the system to account. We want to be stopping it happening. And that's what is really special about treaty. It enables Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a say about what's happening in the first place. And that's where we really want to get to. And that is stopping children hitting these horrific systems, and stop talking about the systems itself, and invest in those sorts of solutions that were evidenced in the videos. And I can't wait to see what they do with treaty.
So it's going to take a little while for organisations to make their plans and to implement them, and to indicate to those of us who aren't Aboriginal how we can assist. It's going to take a little while.
Yeah, it is. Again, Victoria, a little bit different to the rest of the country in what Paul was speaking to, the agreement to hand over in child protection, that effectively hand over the system is there. So guardianship is in there, and this has been a massive journey. When we talk about community, when we're talking about the transfer of authority, it's a massive journey, and you've got to move at the speed that your communities are ready to move at, because this is really tough work. Historically, the Aboriginal communities that talk in this space have always spoken first and foremost, and that is stop children entering the system, invest in your families, invest in culture, invest in those things that we know keep children safe and strong. But as it stands, we know that there is a system and it is driving incredible biases, and the children that are being impacted on are Aboriginal. Now, I know I talked about how you drill the data, and every time you go through the data, you see something a little bit uglier. So what we've seen in places where we've started to move to delegated authority is, well, if we can interfere, not interfere is the wrong word, but if we can interrupt that, and again, Victoria, one of the first places to move on delegated authority, which essentially means giving Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people the opportunity to make decisions about what will happen to their children in care. It's often misconstrued with being the pointy end, which is we have legislative power. But in actual fact, delegated authority is that spectrum, you know, you're moving along a line as to where your communities might be at. In Victoria, VACA in particular has been able to move into investigations, because as they've gone along that continuum, they've found that there's still another problem. So Noogle in particular, the first of its kind in the country, they were doing an incredible job, still do an incredible job based on, Paul spoke to Auntie Energy. I don't know if you've ever met Auntie Muriel. She says it's not named after her. No one believes that. So, and it basically says, you know, an auntie, she's the one that's going to love you. She's going to love you and wrap you up. Everyone's got a favourite auntie. She's also going to growl at you if you're not doing your job properly, if you're not behaving properly. And that's what Big Auntie brings in. And it was having some incredible results. But the way I understand it from aunties, it became really obvious that that particular organisation was also going to need to have a conversation about investigations, because that was getting to the really pointy end. And again, when they drilled the data, the investigations were still biased. So and again, this is only that particular journey. Each of wherever you are, there'll be a different journey. There'll be communities that don't want to do that. But what they will all tell you is we need to step up to the plate on family-led decision-making, often called FLDM, and that is understanding if there is a child at risk, you need to be able to talk to their broader family first. It's a really easy one. And to say, is there somewhere else this baby can go? How do we look after this baby? How do we communicate with you? How do we strengthen you? Because ideally, you do want children to be not only have a voice in that, but have connections through their families whenever they come into trouble.
And Catherine, when you use the word family, you're referring not just to the nuclear family, are you? Could you say a little bit about that?
All right. Yeah. So when we talk about families, we are talking about families. So one of the most startling stories I heard about delegated authority came out of Brisbane, and this particular story was related to the transfer of delegated authority and family-led decision-making in Brisbane. So there was a child in care, had been in care for numerous years, and it was at the point where residential care was pretty much the only option. And as that case child, I should say child, that is what is far more important, as the child was referred into the Aboriginal organisation, they said, why has there been no contact with family? We cannot find the family member. Who did you try and reach? And they said, well, we tried mum, we tried dad, we tried the grandparents. And this particular organisation said, well, what about their family, their biggest family? So within 2 weeks of this little baby going to an Aboriginal organisation for care, they found in 2 weeks 200 relatives. Every single one of the 200 relatives said, I will step up and offer a home to this baby until mum and dad are ready. That's how big our families can be. Yes. 200.
That's a powerful answer. Thank you. Yes. Does anyone else here have a question?
They did a good job.
Yes, Alan.
Thank you for that challenging presentation. It really makes us think very hard. On the one hand, it seems like an area filled with problems and almost overwhelming. But it at the same time, when you showed the examples of the culturally accepting groups, there is a way.
Right.
And I was kind of struck by a similar parallel in immersion programs of language teaching in some schools. So I was thinking teaching French, to have half of the classes given in French and half of them given in English, so that all of the children learn both languages and to be able to do their schoolwork in both languages. And the reason I thought of that parallel was because if it's a different issue than a totally segregated school. If you only have culture and language of the Indigenous group and no English or different cultural settings, the gap still has to be bridged in some other way. So I'm just sort of thinking, and particularly because there are so many different Indigenous languages all around the country, that to have programs that are taught in the language group of the area where the majority of Indigenous people come from, but of course they move around and they're from different language groups and different cultural groups as well. But setting up programs that predominantly are based on the culture of the particular Indigenous community and the language of that community, and introducing some English as well. It's quite a logistical challenge.
Oh, look, you know, when you read a fairy tale and you think you've got a wicked problem, the best part of that fairy tale is that there's always an awesome solution. There's always an awesome ending. And I think bilingual education is one of those, and it actually is one of those examples of where outcomes in bilingual education have not been evaluated in a way Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people would evaluate them. So I actually went to a bilingual school when I was younger. Wallace Rockall School, which is one of the outstations of the Undaria community. So we had Aranda half the day and English the other half of the day, and that was the way we learnt. At that point in time, the school was administered by the Lutheran Mission. When that school transferred to the Department of Education, the policy at that time was that bilingual education would no longer be delivered. The reason it was not going to be delivered anymore in that community was because, well, actually there's a few. The first one was that the data sets were showing that children in schools that were bilingual were not getting better educational outcomes, so they weren't increasing. The second was that you can't get teachers who can speak the language, therefore you can't teach it. And in order to be able to teach the curriculum, you need to be able to speak English. So there are a couple of problems with that particular scenario. The first is measuring the outcomes of the school based on what language you were being taught in was the incorrect measure. When we're talking about the connection to culture, it is what did that mean for that child to be able to learn their own language, to be able to write their own language, to be able to practice their own language and be really proud that they were able to do that. Very few of our families can do that, and everyone is jealous of the ones that can. So there was a fundamental difference in how an Aboriginal person would have valued the success of bilingual education. The second one was there are multiple models of that type of delivery internationally that could have been brought in that would not only have ensured that it was taught, but created jobs for people in that community. And jobs are a massive problem in remote communities because all the jobs are designed elsewhere. Again, policy determined it. For an example of what that might look like in broader communities, when we had COVID and government made policies about what jobs would still be viable, that's probably the first time people who weren't Aboriginal experienced what it was like to be told what jobs will survive and what jobs won't. That's what it is like on remote communities. So that is a job. And the international models have shown that you can actually have a scribe. So you can employ your first language speaker. You can have a scribe that gets you through your training as an Aboriginal educator. And if you can't, and if for whatever reason you need to use your scribes differently, then they can do translation. So there's multiple ways that we can do it. Again, that's a job. The scribe could have been a job because in any community, there's always going to be someone whose English skills are more advanced, but there's plenty of speakers. So we haven't looked at the problem from not only creatively and how we could have structured it, but what the value add to that community would be, increasing those jobs, increasing the ability for children to stay at school, because when you've got your own educators in the school, I tell you what, you behave better. We're far more scared of our nanas than anybody else. And I think big auntie energy is an example of that. So it is possible. Again, that other nuance you were talking about with the difference in dialects. So my nana's country in particular, we would say we speak Lurija in my family from my nana's country. But if you can speak Lurija, you can speak Pindjana, Yagunjana, Nanganjara, Mangajara. So that becomes an opportunity to have one of those languages centralized. But more importantly, if you're able to then bring in the different language speakers, each of those languages has a different tone, a different pace. So Lurija, very beautiful language, a lot slower than the Pindjana, Yagunjanas and the Manganjaras, and has slightly different words. So, but those things are things that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can pick up. So for example, in my language, if you're saying something's really good, you go jingu. If you're speaking Pindjana, it's wiru. Very, very similar. So easy enough to pick up. Again, when we're thinking about language preservation and revitalisation, in my grandfather's country, the language that is taught in the school, and very rudimentary, and again, you only get it in the first couple of years. So you get a few words, but again, every Aranda kid is so proud to be able to be taught Aranda, but so are the non-Indigenous children in those schools. They love it. They love coming up and saying, Quadja. Do you know what Quadja means? It means water. So there's that opportunity, but that language that they're speaking in that school is not the language for that country. So there's an opportunity there to pick up my grandfather's language, the Mbundarinja language that belongs on that country, and restore it, because that only has less than 20 fluent speakers left. Similarly, the other language my nana speaks, Pradama, is in the most vulnerable language lists. Again, they're jobs for communities. They're different ways of being able to engage families in schools. We all know community engagement and parental engagement in schools is actually 90% of your journey. So there is a very different way of looking at this problem. We just have to be creative.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Certainly.
Do you think in the way that the Victorian government has delegated the childcare in the child protection system to Aboriginally controlled organisations, that a pilot project of allocating responsibility for a culturally appropriate and language appropriate Indigenous school system would be worth a trial?
My gut is the Koori's already working on that. And again, I can't ever speak for somebody else's country. That's a big no-no. But I know that what I understand about the incredible work that is happening in Victoria is they're always looking at those things. Again, this part of the country hit very badly by things like massacres, impacted on very heavily by the missions who, again, these were policies. And at the time, perhaps people thought they were doing the right thing, but that meant that these mob you know, their languages took a massive hit, but what I see in Victoria is an incredible response from the mob from all over this country to revitalise their languages in any way, shape or form they can, to dance their dances, rebuild those songs. And, you know, they're so powerful. They brought the country's first treaty. So I would be very surprised if that's not somewhere on their agenda.
Thank you.
People on Zoom, you can use the chat function to ask a question if you, or make a comment should you so wish. Is there anything else from the auditorium here? I'd like to ask you if you know anything about the preschool home instruction program that is rolled out with Aboriginal families in, at least in Victoria and New South Wales. Come across that program at all?
I haven't come across that program, no.
It's called Hippie.
Oh, Hippie. Oh, absolutely. I know
Yes,
Hippie.
please tell us what you know.
Yeah. So again, I'm not intimately associated with Hippie here in Victoria. However, I can tell you the story that I relayed about the little boy who my grandfather learned me how to hunt kangaroo and learned me how to look for snakes. That came from the Hippie program.
Okay.
And a lot of what they've been able to do in working, so in that, I think that's a story from Fink, I'm pretty certain. And Fink, that particular program there is delivered by the NPY Women's Council, the Nganjara Pitjantjatjara Yanganjara Women's Council, and their methodology is everything is framed by Anungu. So Anungu decide how they're going to deliver it, and they effectively said, well, we want to talk to our kids about what makes them happy, and we want to invest in that. And that story actually came from that. So they really talk to the strengths of children. One of the really powerful things that I saw come out of this particular project within the Hippie program was, and this will interrelate with that story, was the Superheroes project. So the first community to get that program was Imanpa, which is just a little bit away from where I grew up as a kid. And again, a lot of my family on that community. And they went out there first and they said to the children on that community, what's a superhero? You might know what a superhero is. And everyone goes, yeah, Spider-Man. You know, Superman, yeah, we know superheroes. Well, what would your superhero be? And they said, May. Our superhero would have a superhero, but would have a superpower called May. Now, May means food. And that is the first superhero that those children on that community designed, a superhero that could bring food. The second one was Jamu, which is a grandfather. So that means your connection to your family. There was Inma. Inma means dance and song, because dancing and singing, and again, our culture makes us feel song. Inkara is the law. You've got to have someone that brings the law. And as they went through it, these children, and this is what I pointed to this a little bit in my oration, children fundamentally understand what the domains of well-being are, and the children stepped out all the characteristics of well-being in their superheroes. Towards the end, they started saying, well, you know, what about other sorts of superheroes? Because you've identified the things that you need to feel strong. But, you know, we talked about Spider-Man and, you know, Superman, you know who these people are. Do you need one like that too? And they said, oh, well, we want Cobweb Girl. And Cobweb Girl, her superpower is to throw her web into Alice Springs to capture all the kids from their community before they get locked up by police. Children fundamentally understand what is happening in their lives. So that was, again, how Aboriginal people were using the power of the Hippie program in the way that they understood it. But again, I'm not familiar with how it's rolled out here in Victoria.
Yes, it probably varies from location to location, but focuses upon preschool children, and that's what, well, in your presentation you indicated the younger the better. It's the from the baby in arms upwards, really. Okay, well, I think we're going to be drawing to a close very soon. But before we do, invite you to sit here.
Sure.
And I'm going to ask Dr. Alan Maudsley, the company secretary of MIF, to come and say a few words and to bring our function to a close.
Thank you, Susie. Firstly, my name is Alan Maudsley. I'm the Vice President of the MIF Committee, standing in for the presidential role, vacant since the resignation of Dr. Joe Grimwade, who gave valiant service for about a last decade. I thank Joe for his service and note that we're awaiting nominations for his successor at our forthcoming annual general meeting in August. As well as Vice President of the committee, I'm also the Company Secretary of the MIF Board of Directors, about which I'll speak more shortly. Thanks. Firstly, it's my privilege to thank our orator, Catherine Liddle, for a truly memorable oration. The acknowledgement of country that we always give at our meetings has been brought into vivid perspective by the exploration of disadvantage our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children experience as a consequence of the occupation of the land by non-Indigenous settlers. Fortunately, the oration has shown us some ways in which our duty of care to redress the disadvantage can be undertaken. The oration is now permanently on record in our archives and shortly to be on our website for all time to offer guidance. Thank you. As a tiny token of our appreciation, I would like you to accept this gift and card expressing our thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Secondly, I must thank last year's orator, Paul McDonald, for his thoughtful response to Catherine's oration, which opened the discussion. Thank you, Paul. Thirdly, I say thanks to the Rickards family for the continuing support. The oration, of course, is named after our founding president, Dr. Winston Rickards, former Director of Mental Health Services at the Royal Children's Hospital, whose advocacy for multidisciplinary support for children's mental health was the inspiration for our organisation. After his death, his widow, Dr. Anne Rickards, and the family have enthusiastically supported the annual orations. Sadly, Anne died earlier this year, and her memorial service highlighted her similarly important contribution to children's mental health. At the conclusion of this evening's event, I'm hoping that any members of the family will join the presenters for a commemorative photograph before mingling with our attendees in the foyer outside. Finally, I say thanks to the other organisations who undertook to co-sponsor the oration in recognition of its importance in highlighting the mental health of children. These Emerging Minds Australia, the Mental Health Foundation of Australia, the Faculty of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, the Centre for Community Child Health of the Royal Children's Hospital, and the Royal Children's Hospital Mental Health Service. Thank you to those co-sponsors. Now, a note about MIF. For the last 25 years, MIF Vic has operated as an incorporated association in Victoria, but we are now at a watershed in our history. On Christmas Eve 2025, we became a nationally incorporated company, MIF. Over and above the management committee, we now have a board of directors to monitor the implementation of our strategic plan. We are in the process of seeking registration as a mental health promotion charity regulated by the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. The work that we've been doing for 25 years is continuing. These orations, our educative workshops, such as one I'm giving myself next Monday on when life seems not worth living, depression in adolescence. Anyone's interested, you can just go on Zoom for that next Monday. Those things will continue, but we are trying to extend these kinds of activities nationally now instead of just in Victoria. We are keen to be joined by people interested in any aspects of the work we do. It's not necessarily a commitment to the whole range of work, just the bits that interest you. Contact me to talk about what potential connections might be possible. We have a space for you at any level, from the board of directors, the management committee, project groups on aspects of mental health, and new ventures such as helping to build a presence on social media that we don't do at all yet. So we need lots of people, and you can find your niche if you're willing. Most especially for people who are already involved in other like-minded organisations, we want to develop a network of relationships that are mutually supportive so that becoming a liaison person between the two organisations to foster the link would be greatly appreciated. If nothing else, make sure you maintain your financial membership of MIF, $50 to keep you in touch with what we're doing. This closes the evening's activities, except for foyer conversations and our commemorative photograph that we will do as soon as the meeting closes. So formally close the meeting.
Thanks very much, Alan. And just say that our photographer, Ross Mortimer, who has very generously for all of the orations, I think, has been here to commemorate the event. He will now welcome us here, and with this we say goodbye to our Zoom participants, and we look forward to seeing you on other occasions. Thank you very much.